Good morning. Since we finished with pre-romantic poetry, we now begin romantic poetry. But before starting with the poems, I'd like to tell you about the romantic age. What is the romantic age? What is romanticism? What is romantic poetry? And then we move on to the individual poets of the period. What is Romanticism? You see, Romanticism came in as a movement in arts and literature that originated in the late 18th century. It emphasized inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual. It was a parallel movement in arts and literature. It came about in the late 18th century. It emphasized upon inspiration, upon subjectivity, and upon the primacy, upon the importance of the individual. You will always find some of the qualities which were present in the pre-romantic poetry too. In a nutshell, Romanticism was characterized by 5 I's. Which are these? Imagination, intuition, idealism, inspiration, and individualism. Imagination. This kind of poetry was from the heart, not from the head. So you see, there was a lot of imagination. And as you read, you'll wonder what kind of imaginations could there be? This kind of poetry was a poetry of intuition. It has a lot of prophecies. One has a feeling that something may come up, and the poet expresses that feeling beautifully. Then you have a lot of idealism. Shelley is noted for his idealism, and many consider them strong-headed. Inspiration. It was a weird kind of inspiration, strange inspiration coming in. And a lot of stress was upon individuality. When I say subjectivity, that has been converted to an I, that is individuality. And the poet loved to talk about, not about others, but about himself. Coming to romantic poetry. So what is romantic poetry? Here is a definition of romantic poetry. Romantic poetry is the poetry of the Romantic era, an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century. It involved a reaction against prevailing Enlightenment ideas of the 18th century and lasted approximately from 1800 to 1850. So what do you get from the definition? Romantic poetry belongs to the Romantic era. It was a parallel movement in art, literature, music, and other fields. And it originated in Europe. And the period is late 18th century. It came in as a reaction to classicism, which means it came in as a reaction against the prevailing Enlightenment ideas, which was prevalent in 18th century. And this period lasted approximately from 1800 to 1850. You see, you have the characteristics of classical and romantic poetry here. Classical poetry was characteristic of reason and judgment. See, that is why a lot of mock epics were written. Heroic poetry was a feature of classical uh, poetry, but Romanticism gave way to imagination and emotion. A lot of imagination as well as emotion was used in this kind of poetry. In classical poetry, there was a lot of concern with the universal experience. What is happening to somebody else? What is happening in the nobility? What is happening amongst the high class people? But in romantic poetry, you find only concern with the particular experience. That is why it's so subjective. And even when it talks of men and manners, it is of the ordinary people. In classical poetry, you have value of society as a whole, but in romantic poetry, it is value of the individual. The individual might be a very common figure like a reaper, a young maiden, or a thing even. Classical poetry had a lot of value of rules. Rules in writing. There should be rhyming. One should adhere strictly to the metrical form. But in romantic poetry, there was value for freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of expression. It was all influenced by the French Revolution. The early romantics wrote after the French Revolution, which is why they valued freedom. Coming again back to what is romantic poetry? The romantic poetry is the poetry of sentiments, of emotion, of imagination. It is opposed to the objectivity of neoclassical poetry. Why? Neoclassical poets avoided describing their personal emotions in their poetry, whereas the Romantics began to express more and more of their personal emotions. You've had a taste of it in the pre-Romantic poets, like one talking about the um, portrait of his mother and having a feeling that the mother is before him, and of Gray, who talks about the common people who are dead and who are not talked of a lot. You have this kind of poetry, or you have the description of the weather, of the seasons, of some time of the day. All these are characteristic features of romantic poetry. Here are the characteristics of English romantic poetry. Romanticism came in several other languages too. You'll find Romanticism in Hindi, in Urdu, and in several other languages spoken all over the world. But when we talk of English Romantic poetry, you have these characteristics. The first is that it was a strong reaction against neoclassicism. It came out of the clutches of the upper class, of the description of their men and manners, and strict adherence to a rhyme, meter, and other form. The next characteristic is a lot of role of imagination. One could imagine anything in this kind of poetry. And there are beautiful descriptions. When you describe nature, you describe it in full. Coming to nature poetry, you have large descriptions of nature poetry. Of course, you've begun this year with a beautiful description of winter and autumn in the pre-romantic poets. But when you begin to read romantic nature poetry uh, of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, and of course Byron, then you will really get a taste of what nature poetry is. There is a lot of scope for melancholy in this kind of poetry. The poet is often sad, he is often alone. And there's description of medievalism. There is a lot of love for medievalism. Wordsworth at one time points out that he wants to go back to the medieval times. Coleridge also describes the medieval times and manners. Then there is this Hellenism. They had a great love for everything Greek. So a lot of Hellenism comes in their kind of poetry. There is description of supernatural also in many of the English Romantic poets. Even the natural are regarded as supernatural. And of course, a lot of subjectivity is there. You see, Romantic poetry emerged out of the collaboration of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth and Coleridge planned the lyrical ballads. They planned a volume together in which Wordsworth decided to present the natural as supernatural and Coleridge decided to present the supernatural as natural. So, they also provided a treatise describing their kind of poetry, describing their kind of uh, thoughts regarding uh, what poetry should be. If we go into details of each of these poets, we will find what they wrote and, of course, why they wrote. You see, I've tried to collect some pictures which will describe these emotions that I am talking about. Here is a loner, this lone kind of a person who is trying to look at the sea and is in a very pensive, solitary mood. You have nature at its best. Nature can be described as much as possible. It is beautiful and this imagery captures the attention of every kind of poet. You have the description of the skylark in Ode to Skylark. You have the description of the nightingale in Ode to Nightingale. And the Grecian urn in Ode on a Grecian Urn. Then you have the description of a cloud in Shelley's Cloud. You have the sea in Byron. But first, we will talk about Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, who describes the daffodils as in this picture. Daffodils is not prescribed for you, but it is always advantageous to begin with this poem so as to understand Wordsworth's emotions, so as to understand Wordsworth's philosophy and his love for nature. And then we will move on to the solitary reaper. Here are the poets of the Romantic period. You have Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, Blake, and Coleridge. You've read a bit about Blake. Blake is also considered as the pre-romantic, as well as he is also one of the early romantic poets. This is all about the romantic age, the romantic poetry, and the kind of poetry that is coming your way. So, as we read each of the poets, you'll start admiring them, and you don't want to move to the next one. By the time you read the next one, you will start admiring him, and you can't leave the first one. You'll admire the second one, then the third one, then the fourth one, and so on. So, this is the best kind of poetry. This is the most beautiful poetry that one can read in life. So, consider yourself very privileged. This is all for now. Thank you. Happy reading and enjoy this romantic poetry as we move on to the individual poets. Thank you.